Uh, let me just see here in. So just, I'm not sure if everyone saw in the WhatsApp group, but we got a really positive answer from the editors. Apparently, we're going to get a second answer. We got a first one from one of the editors who's more concerned, like the editorial line, and he said, I think Max, his name Max. He said that we can have the text actually, we can have any length, really, which I think is a very dangerous gift to give us. But so I think we should try to keep it short, each section, but if it, goes a bit overboard, it's not the end of the world. So that was a good answer. And he also said that they're very interested in us trying something else in terms of style and the way that the things are presented. But the other editor of the journal will get in contact in the next couple of weeks with us to talk about what can be done, how much they can change it, because they're still kind of figuring. Apparently, there is an artist who does the cover and the idea for the styling. So they will have to compatibilize our paper with this bigger project. So, but apparently it's, anyway, the answer was the reply was very good. So I think we can pretty much keep things as planned. I think that from what I've seen, there's already quite a lot underway. Rafael is already wrote a lot. I tried the first draft today for the introduction to the diagram. I know that Yasha already has some bullet points for the introduction to the more. Actually, now that I'm trying to find this. Yeah. So basically, he and Reza are writing about just an introduction to the approach and what we call objective phenomenology. So they're already starting to work on that as well. John, you said you're gonna try to condense some of the stuff from your second presentation, right?
Yeah. I kind of went back. I think I want to zoom out just a little bit and kind of look at not just the way that B branches into B plus C, but the way it splits into both by using that history of the Mongolian Empire I kind of touched on very briefly. And I think I can do it in a very condensed fashion that doesn't necessarily explicate how I'm translating that history into our language, but I can kind of lay it out in a way that makes sense. And then kind of point towards other places that we'll be able to develop it down the road.
Yeah, one thing that I wanted to talk to you about that actually has to do with something that became a bit clearer to me now, also about when I was writing this introduction to the diagram, which is something that I think that since your text, I mean, I'm not sure between your section and Alan's section, because I know Alan wants to talk about what sort of specific fetishism exists for mode B. I've been talking to him a lot, and he has a really cool thesis that we can actually define, let's say, a fetishistic structure for. At first, he said mode B and mode C, so commodity fetishism, but there is something like a power fetishism in mode B.
Yeah, and that's where the whole idea of the sovereign is kind of mode B's version of capital really comes in and plays strong.
Yeah, totally. But I was talking to him and I said, because I know he likes anthropology and Lévi-Strauss a lot, and I said man, but you should also have a, why doesn't mode A have a fetishism? Why is it deprived of this? and I had an idea that we started talking about that I think it's a cool idea, which is to say, in our approach, we make a distinction between objective phenomenology, which is, let's say, displacing the I from the perspective of individuals to the perspective of some object that exists inside the logic, right? So the fact that commodities look at other commodities, that's not fetishism. That's just the logical value. When you try to see capitalism from your standpoint, that's fetishism. And it's a kind of transcendental illusion in the sense that you're obliged, if you want to see from your perspective the logic of value, you need to, let's say, act as if everything is an object. So you fetishize objects and everything is a thing. So relations between things are how capitalism appears to us. But for capital itself, for value, this is not true. Like, the logic of value doesn't make that distinction between things and people. It doesn't give a shit. Like, people can be commodities, things can be commodities, natural resources can be commodities. Like, it doesn't matter, right? So talking about people and things, that's not the internal language of value. That's
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
external language, and that's what we call fetishism. And I think what Alain,
Well, I think what makes sense on TB is that like the state doesn't differentiate between material inert stuff in humans when it looks at things in terms of resources. Everything is a resource.
yeah, but wouldn't you say that the state, like, when, again, I agree with you, the state doesn't make that distinction. Treating things as resources is, let's say, the inside language of the state, right? What that Scott guy calls, let's say, how the state makes things legible to itself.
Okay. Like an internal language. Yeah.
Yeah, but there is the external language, which is how does the state appear to us? And I think that we can define it by saying that while the fetishism of commodities require us to force everything into the position of object, the fetishism of power forces us to put everything in the position of subject. So everything is a subject. There is like the right private person. I don't know how to say this, like the juridical person, right?
Yeah, like the private. Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, and objects are private subjects in that sense. So, for example, we can talk about, right? Yeah. Objects have rights, like you've damaged property.
Yeah.
Things like this. So, and then the fetishism of mode A would be the fetishism of the relation between things and people.
Yeah.
So,
which would be precisely where like a critique of mysticism could come in, is where everything is like one in this simplistic sense. Is this kind of like,
yeah, everything is related to everything. Like, that's not how mode A works.
Well, and that's also powerful in terms of trying to understand nationalism, because what you see right now with conspiracy theories is a kind of like mysticism of TA, where everything's interconnected with everything else, built on this,
it's a good point.
Cult of personality. When you look at, like, you know, I'm going to go with Trumpism, but you can say with Bolsonarismo or any of these other things, right? Like, you have this synthesis between like a community which is like synergistically interconnected and a strongman personality which kind of like embodies the sovereign. And
and I think
it just kind of disregards capitalism, right? It like it will address it as it needs to, but it kind of like leaves it to the side. Sometimes we give tax cuts to the rich, sometimes we go after big companies, we just kind of deal with it as we need to, but it's not really necessary.
But I think that the crucial point there, the crucial analogy would be that the internal language of gifts and reciprocities, it's true that it treats everything as persons, right? You can, like, nature is a person, you negotiate with nature and so on, but that's not the fetishism, because persons don't coincide with people or with things. God knows what will count as a person from a reciprocal point of view, but you can fetishize it by thinking that you need to always adopt the point of view of the relations. So there is a fetishism of A, which is, let's say,
whereas in TB, what defines being subject is being part of a limited set of subjects. Your subjects under a particular sovereign. There is like a boundary, whereas the subjectivity of TA is like infinitely, everything is equally a person.
Yeah, again, I think we need to be careful there, because the logic of reciprocity, it has its own kind of, people use this idea of personhood because it, like Marilyn Strathern will say something like, well, while commodity fetishism reifies everything, turns everything into things, you know, reciprocity turns everything into people and persons. Okay, you could say that, so the form of an object is always the form of a person, just like the form of an object in capitalism is always the form of a commodity. So let's say you only recognize nature if you can single out, classify its parts in terms of population of persons, like entities of all sorts that you can negotiate with, forces that want things, and so on. right? But let's say, if you're not adopting that logic, you're looking at it from the outside. I think it has a lot to do with what you said about conspiracy, because networks become this sort of fetishistic entry door. Like, again, it's a transcendental illusion. It's not a deformation. It's not false consciousness. It's the best you can do from your own standpoint, is to see networks, right? And to think that relations are connecting people. But if you're not allowing those relations to actually define what counts as people, you're just taking your empirical evidence as the people that counts, that's fetishism, because you're ascribing to the relations this sort of entry door into the world of reciprocity. So it does give us a sort of three types of fetishism, right? Which I think it's an interesting thing. Why am I saying this, John? Is because I'm not sure if Alain is going to cover this, but I think that one of the sections that deals with the state should have something about, let's say, the internal objects to the logic of the state that are able to see a lot, right? The privileged standpoints from inside that logic.
That's actually really perfect. I think that's a really good way to, because I think that is a good way to structure the history of when you look at what was actually, what was being built by Genghis Khan and the actual institution was an apparatus to see his empire and to make decisions about flows and whatnot. Things like turning rural areas into pasture so that the cavalry can move quickly, and developing postal systems and unifying languages and metrics. Like, they were ways of homogenizing to enable that kind of seeing that you're talking about. So totally.
I think, why am I saying this? Because when I was writing this introduction to the diagram, I was talking to Rafael here, I realized that we have three critiques to Karatani. Two of them, in fact, are critiques to mode D, because we decided not to use it. So one is, let's say, just the critique, which is to say, well, mode D is not really, Karatani doesn't even use it that productively. It's kind of like in Portuguese, we would say a bag of cats. Like when you have a bunch of properties that are not connected and you just put them all into one kind of collection. It's a bag of cats of properties that he calls mode D, mostly in order to be able to claim, in a way that is consistent with the rest of his theory, that there is a fourth mode of exchange that can harbor a new society, and you can kind of trust it, right? We kind of don't need that, because we have this more experimental take on politics. So there is a critique of mode D. Then there is the idea that we can substitute it for something which is more active. Then there's a third point, which I think connects with this thing I was saying, John, which is a materialist question to Karatani would be, how does he historically explain that we can see these different logics? Because his theory is that there's a transcendental reduction that authors and specific thinkers did in order to capture the pure forms of these logics. But that's kind of suggesting that somebody just had an idea and did it in a piece of conceptual writing. It answers the question of who conceptualized a certain object. It doesn't answer how was that object constituted to begin with as a possible object for a conceptualization. And I think that we have two answers to this that need to go together. I think the strongest answer is that, our theory of political experiments accounts for this in a materialist way, right? Political experiments, they challenge different aspects of social formations. And according to the Bogdanov thesis, that through interaction, we learn about the world. By interacting with the social formation, we kind of abstract this object. So it's further confirmation that our substitute theory for mode D is useful. It becomes useful not as a kind of political prescription about the future, but because it gives the materialist basis for the modeling of A, B, and C. And second, we have also a different answer, which is this internal objects, right? meaning transcendental reductions are not done by transcendental subjects, like Kantian cognitive agents. They are done by objects inside those worlds. So you see the pure logic of mode C when you displace your position to that of the value form or the money commodity. You see the purity of mode B when you displace your position to that of the sovereign or some other object, right? So we have two answers. Like the big answer is that politics comes before the model of society. And actually, that's not, and Dennis said this to me the other day, and I think it's true, which means that Karatani's model is not an analytic model. It's a synthetic model. It's actually synthesizing a bunch of political modelings of social reality, which were separate. And he managed to kind of find a schema to bring them together, right? But the analysis itself happened before, happens in real political practice. And I think that there is something to be said about, you know, kind of a redescription of ethnography as at its best, having some political import, or, you know, the very objects. I mean, this is, Karatani goes as far as saying this, that Hobbes could never have written the Leviathan if there wasn't the Glorious Revolution and the fear of the total overthrowing of the state. Right? So either as reactive people or as sort of adventurous claims that other cultural or social groups or their cosmologies are true and rational, or as the theorists of the First International, which Marx also was. So you can actually account for these things from the standpoint of the political processes that do the real abstraction of these objects, right?
I also think that that's where, like, we can also look at TB as a space, like as a space that organizes and tries to solve certain kind of problems and doesn't have to be reducible to the state. And that's where I think like problems of logistics, infrastructure, these kind of like categories that, these big categories that Lefebvre gets into around like differentiating space and whatnot, like that's a kind of problem solving that we also need to experiment in. But you have to kind of like define the space by clarifying how it grounds the state without being identical to the state, I guess is the challenge, I think. And that's where I think like the Mongolian history is so interesting, because in growing so quickly, they developed a minimal logistical state that kind of shows like the bare bones lineaments of a state and doesn't have a lot of, it wasn't very hybrid in the way most states are with earlier forms of TA. If you look at like Roman history, for example, there are these constant kind of like alliances between different community kinship networks that like gradually like interconnected with the history of the state. And so we've taken this, and similar with like, even more so with like ancient Greek history, we've taken these as kind of like prototypes of what states look like, but they already often have a lot of like TA built directly into them. What's interesting about Mongolian history is you had the Mongolian Empire on the one hand and the Mongolian nation on the other, and Genghis Khan strictly divided them. And so you almost have this kind of like clear definition between where TA stops and where TB begins in this really interesting way. And because it grew so quickly, it also collapsed very quickly. So we kind of see how its crises developed in a very kind of crisp, clean way. So I think there's kind of ways to explore that internal language, those internal objects, and the way kind of problems emerge within that space. And I think we, at this point, I can do it fairly succinctly since we're trying to go.
That would be really cool, man. But also, I think that this is important because, so like, if we were to highlight in the big diagram, the section that you're actually intervening on is partially in the diagram and partially, let's say, before it, right? Because you're dealing with the formation of the Mongolian Empire, which is something that precedes the dominance of Mode C.
Yeah, and in many ways, like it's in that period of transition from TB dominance to TC dominance, you know, and you see some kind of like immediate proto-capitalist things happen even a kind of like early mercantilist thing starts to develop in the Mongolian Empire before it collapses. So you kind of see the rudiments of what could have been East Asian capitalism as opposed to Western Asian European capitalism.
Mhm.
So yeah, like you can definitely see that, and you can kind of see where these logics, where you see like, you know, Genghis Khan is born into this small tribe, even for like the people of the area, where it's very much still like the nomadic norm. It's not even a fully developed kinship network. It's literally, he's in that very beginning of the Karatanian process. And by the end of it, they have an almost world class, like global economy. And so you see like multiple kind of like nice, it's in a way, it's more Hegelian than a lot of the history Hegel liked, because the stages are just so abrupt and clear between like small tribal formation, tribal nation, Mongolian nation, Eastern empire, global empire. And suddenly like all these dynamics keep shifting as you kind of move up each level. And each of those levels are sometimes only like a decade or two apart. So it all moves really quickly.
Yeah, I just think that like I'm kind of trying to suggest. I mean, the thing that how to put this, like, perhaps Alan will deal with this already, and we don't need to worry about it. But I think that either his section or your section should. I mean, I'm not gonna like, I don't think it's a necessary bibliography, but just for the sake of kind of an example, you know, this "Seen Like a State" text by that Scott, James Scott. I don't remember.
You sent it to me. I haven't had a chance to read it.
Yeah, I think that I think you'll find, I mean, just read the first chapter. I think you'll find it ridiculously on point. Like, he pretty much tells a story of like basic state formation as being the development in very different areas, like management of forests, establishment of common metrics, and things like this. But his theory is that all these things exist so that the world might become legible for a state.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
He goes very, very, very close to the sort of objective phenomenology thing. You know, like he talks about legibility, which is kind of a, I don't know, ambivalent word perhaps, but because it might overemphasize, you know, why things are uniform because or the written form or things like this. But I think that his core idea is just kind of showing that what we associate with the strategy, with state strategies for organizing communities and so on, are mostly connected to making sure large territories are legible for some dominant community, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that idea of that there is some, that the state form is connected with making things legible to a center should appear somewhere, because part of our initial critique of Karatani hinges on that we can actually displace this theory of transcendental reductions that happen to theorists to the theory of transcendental reductions that happen to objects inside those modes, right? There is an I inside each mode that sees the objects of that mode, be them people, nature, or whatever, right? So somewhere I think we should be able to add this, because otherwise it will be missing. But from what you're saying, it seems like that's actually a particularly good case study to see this, right?
Yeah, I'd be happy. Like, I mean, I'm sure what Alon's looking at, I mean, if it makes sense, we should take it from multiple angles, but it definitely makes sense to look at like a concrete case of like something in history where there was a very intentional goal of doing that. And it gives like a good example of where that works. So yeah, totally. I can work that in explicitly. I was wondering if you had access to that PDF that you sent out on the hexagonal logic, because it was paywalled for me.
Okay, I'll send it. I'll send it now on our.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to see what, you know,
it's totally bonkers. So
Yeah.
yeah, I quoted it on the paper like as if it's like the clearest thing. I quoted it in the introduction to the diagram, but
I'm getting used to these papers, like where they lure you in the first third or so with like seemingly like accessible concepts, and the next thing you know, you're in
deep
Alice in
shit.
Wonderland territory.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing with this paper, I really wanted to like take some time with it at some point.
I think we should have I really think we should have at least one meeting about it, because if we're going to use it, seems to be a powerful tool for us.
Yeah, and the guy is actually trying to do something that is, I mean, Guittard, he's a logician who's a friend of Badiou and a Lacanian. And this thing is a development of a previous work that he did called on something he called specular logic, which is a logic that should account for why changing positions changes truth value of statements in accordance to Lacan's formulas of sexuality. So he wanted to kind of formalize the difference between the all and the non-all, that the whole Lacanian thing. And then he said, okay, now I'm gonna, not satisfied, I'm gonna give you the logical structure of the real, symbolic, and imaginary. So he defines the logic for the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. Then he comes up with this structure that binds the three of them under the Borromean property. And if you travel around this structure, the language and the truth value of propositions change with it. So it accounts for paradoxes, contradictions, and so on, right?
Nice.
And not satisfied, if you read part of this paper, you'll see that he starts from, there is this hexagonal structure called the geometry of logical oppositions, which is starts with Aristotle, which has the four values like for possibility, necessity, impossibility, and contingency. Then Apuleios, which is this other Greek, I think, logician, developed like a six-sided structure. He showed that there are not four values, but six modes. And more recently, this French guy called Robert Blanchet kind of started formalizing this hexagon of different kind of modes, logical modalities. And he shows that this real, symbolic, imaginary Borromean object that he constructed covers the six modalities that Blanchet formalized.
Huh.
So yeah, he's not satisfied with doing like a Lacanian thing, which would please Lacanians, like, oh, this diagram has a Borromean property, blah blah blah. But he shows that the different logical modalities of Aristotelian logic are all sections of the thing that he constructed. So it's the guy. Yeah, he's sad.
But that sounds dope.
Yeah, but I managed to follow up to, I don't know, page 3. And then
yeah, no, it's gonna kick me in the head, but it'll be getting used to it more, hanging out in this.
Yeah, but I think we should try at some point, kind of going through it and see what we can learn.
I mean, it opens up so many interesting concrete research questions, like actually, especially like I think the big step for me that I want to explore is from where like this diagram to the three semantics of paraconsistency on TAA, Boolean on TB, and intuitive on TC. Because I feel like if we can make that step like mathematically valid, then like that opens up like that's how you should organize data in a certain kind of way, and that's how you should organize like categories in a pretty interesting way. And then how they kind of like interconnect on these three co-products.
Yeah,
it's also but there's a lot of really interesting like I think like empirical implications of how to use this stuff once it gets if we can prove it all.
Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to look into this. Dennis, I don't know what you think of this, but like I even posted the question in the group, and I think that people were right not to answer or try to, because it's just a bit crazy. But right now, I'm not even sure if this will appear in the text we're writing, but it could if we wanted to go into like I'd be willing to write like a section called an open question, and kind of put the question to the universitarios, as we say in Portuguese, like get the aid of the academics in a, like a Who Wants to Be a Millionaire kind of show, like calling your aid, which is this, like we know that we can account for maps between an intuitionist topos and a Boolean one, like a classical logic one, because we know classical logic is like a restricted case of the intuitionist one. That's kind of an okay, well-established idea. And we can account for the fact that if you go the other way, if you try to project intuitionistic statements onto this classical space, there are things that you'll have to decide their value in a kind of yes or no, true or false case, where that's not the case for the intuitionistic space. So that's already something we can say, and that I think it already has traction empirically with the fact that, let's say, property language is more like a yes or no question, whereas value logic is more like a degrees of equivalence thing. But when you try to account for the mode A, you get into a problem, at least from where we stand right now, because the way we've been trying to describe mode A in terms of logic, something that Thiago and I have been trying to do, is that we are trying to work with a kind of tree-valued logic, which has a kind of, the easiest intuition for it is like a topological one, where you have one value maps two elements into the same neighborhood, into the same point. So you can never make them disjoint, right? So they're in the same neighborhood always. The second value maps them into different neighborhoods that have an intersection. So they have something in common. So they form a similar interior. And the third value maps them into disjoint neighborhoods with no intersection, right? And our take on this is that this can help to construct kind of weird spaces that seem very similar to the spaces that Lévi-Strauss is trying to describe when he talks about dual societies. It accounts for things that other anthropologists talk about in terms of different cosmologies, like animistic, totemistic, analogic, and naturalistic societies, which would be Western ones. And in the case of capitalist formations, where mode A is very restricted to like nuclear families, interest groups, and things like this, nations, it accounts for Lacanian logic, because Lacanian logic is all about there being the one, the other, and that point which is not allowing itself to be divided in fitting into one or the other, right? But we have two options here. Like, we can think of these three values as if it's like true, false, and a sort of true and false, like both P and not P are fitting inside the same kind of statement, which would be like paraconsistent like. Or we can think of it as a sort of just three values of an intuitionistic space, like maximal, true, minimal, false, and something in between.
Yeah.
If we think of it in those terms, I think the relation between the intuitionistic and the reciprocal logic is easier. It's like you're filtering this infinite lattice of values by three values. But if it is paraconsistent, so if this middle value is not in between the other two, it's really neither of the two in any sense, right? It's kind of this contradictory value. Then the issue of how does intuitionistic logic relate to paraconsistent logic becomes important. And the literature on this is fucking crazy.
But wasn't the middle term like something in common? It wasn't completely
Sorry?
out of. you said that the middle term had some intersection, right? Like there was something in common.
Yeah, we're still thinking of this, but it would be something. So if you had like this reciprocity function, right? It would be something like A and B we were writing it like this, but don't think this is necessary. So 0 would mean that you take these two things to be impossible to separate, right? They're the same.
Yeah.
If you get value 1, it means that you have like A and B. You can even map this to this and map this to this, but there will always be something here. So
and then
this
2 is disjoint.
Yeah, so it forms like an interior in this sense.
Okay.
And this is like the same. And 2 would mean that you have A and B, and you can actually map this into one thing and map this into another.
Okay. Because I'm wondering if, like, rather than making a choice, wouldn't those be A plus C would be where the 3-term logic and the meet join kind of logic comes in, whereas A plus B would be paraconsistent.
But what do you mean A plus B? This is just internal to A. Forget the other mode.
Internal to A, but when we're asking about like what happens when the 2 logics meet, like the translation between them, right?
Yeah, but even before we get to that, like we don't even know what A is. So how can we even ask what A plus B would mean, right? So inside one logic, so just to not make confusions, right? So forget A and B, just X and Y here, right?
Oh, sure. I knew that those weren't A and B. I meant that, like, if the question is paraconsistent versus this other logic of like a maximal, a minimal, and something in between, right? That former one is the translation between Boolean and 3-term logic, that one problem. And the other problem is the translation between intuitionist and 3-term logic. So those are 2 different problems, right?
Yeah, so before we ask like how do they map into each other, because I mean we could accept perhaps that when you map mode C, which has that, like it goes from false all the way to true, moving between every possible value here in a way, and A, you could say that A plus C is like the weak version. It's a way of mapping this contradictory value into like an intermediate value. And we could say that this
exactly.
So this version here would be this version, because it's kind of using this and trying to be the most expressive for both of them at the same time. So things are inside or outside, or neither inside nor outside, but in a sort of more like a in between kind of sense, right? This would even explain because 99% of structuralist theories of capitalism are actually dealing with this, like Lacanians saying that, yeah, you have like exchange value and use value, but value is this in-betweenness of what is neither inside or out. Like all these guys saying those sort of stuff, they're trying to do this.
Yeah.
Right? And then they're struggling with this in one way or another. But that doesn't, like, we can't start really seriously talking about this before we know what we mean by this. If we truly mean this, true, false, and true and false. Right? Because, and if we do mean this to be the logic of A, the relation between intuitionist spaces like this one, where you have between true, false and true, you have a bunch of intermediate values, and the logic of, having true, false, and both true and false, it's an kind of open question. Like if you look in the two topics.
Choose? I guess that's my question: is why do we have to choose? Why aren't both of those interpretations valid? One,
because they're not. They don't say the same thing.
They don't say the same thing. Yeah, I get they don't say the same thing, but like when we look at like any existing social world, they're actually compositions out of all of these 3 transcendentals, right?
Yes, man, but like you're going a bit too fast. Like if we don't know how we want to think immanently the logic of A, like are we claiming it is paraconsistent? If it is there a categorical treatment of paraconsistent toposes? Like we don't even know. Like, is there such a thing as a paraconsistent topology? So there are serious problems if we claim that this is what we're talking about, like a bunch of formal difficulties we need to solve. Like, what would it mean to have like a space that, like, if you take a part of it, it's external to this part, but if you take their conjunction, like if you take their envelope, this envelope actually treats everything as the same, right? So in a lower level, in a lower resolution, you would say that this is 2, in a higher resolution. In a lower resolution, looking at a higher covering, you would say it's the same. It's weird, right? That there is a discontinuity inside a point.
Mm-hmm.
And things like this. Like, I haven't found almost any literature on this. And it freaks me out a bit because we're trying to construct something that I'm betting my
I think we just need to become controversial enough that like people have to research paraconsistent topoi in order to try to disprove us and then accidentally prove us correct.
I like that hypothesis, but I just wanted to make clear that, like, at the same time that these crazy ideas in a quasi-formal way have made a lot of nice developments. Like, I've been meeting Thiago every 15 days. We read a classical anthropology text and we try to fit it into this schema. And at least from our kind of amateuristic perspective, he's not an amateur, he's an anthropologist, but from our crazy attempts, it's bizarre how much we can fit together. Like, things that are supposedly unconnected in anthropology, like Lévi-Strauss's theory of restricted and general reciprocity, his theory of dual forms of organization, even the canonical formula of the myth, then Eduardo Viveiros de Castro theory of the Amerindian societies. We actually unify all of that. So it looks very nice in a kind of quasi-formal way, but we can't guarantee the formal steps because it would imply that these ideas exist, like paraconsistent topology, or, a categorical and therefore kind of intuitionistic, because category theory is kind of at home at intuitionistic logic, an intuitionistic modeling of paraconsistency. Is that a thing?
Yeah.
No? And we don't know.
I see what you're saying, yeah.
So there are some really crazy problems that we might have to deal with at some point. And I mean, it's always cool because usually when you're going in a nice direction, you're obliged to come up with nice tools that didn't exist in the process. But this seems a bit too much. Like, I found some papers that show that there is a relation between intuitionistic and paraconsistent logic, which is that a co-intuitionistic logic is paraconsistent, meaning the opposite of the intuitionistic space gives you a paraconsistent space, and you kind of can get that feeling because it's like you invert the two clauses, right? You reintroduce the excluded middle, but remove the non-contradiction, right? Whereas in intuitionistic, you remove the excluded middle and kept the non-contradiction.
I also like it from like Marx's description of like early exchange being on the peripheries of different communities. You can kind of see like they were directly in opposition to each other in a weird kind of way originally.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of interesting things we could follow. Like, for example, it would be crazy to have a historical materialist account of why we only know about 3 basic types of logic: intuitionistic, paraconsistent, and classical, because those are the 3 big social modes of domination we know. Like, that would be like, can you be cheekier than that? I don't think you can. Like, so
this is like Sonratho on like steroids.
Exactly.
Math and whatever.
That would be like the Sonratho would come back to life.
So transcendental relativism.
Yeah, I mean, it would go very far in that direction. Plus,
that's what I'm saying. We get controversial enough to piss off everyone to research the math for us because there's so much research that's like, yeah, I mean, I totally agree. There's so much stuff that hasn't been researched because so many of these problems have come from different problem spaces in history and organizations.
Yeah, so that's crazy. And another thing that I really like, which is I think it would be the final nail in the coffin of what still remains as the sort of last kind of magic trick in the bag of tricks of communist thinkers today, which is, we were talking about this with Karatani, like they want mode A to save us all somehow. Like this is valid for Deleuze with nomadism. This is valid for Karatani. This is valid for Zizek, with Lacan's logic of the extimate having the kernel of revolutionary ideas. It's the only guy I know of that's not valid for is Badiou, because, and why do I say this? Because this logic here looks like, even though it's a consistent logic, it's a paraconsistent logic, it looks as if you came up with a community that accepts contradiction. So it looks like there is impredicativity, because there will be parts of this world that are neither true nor false, right? Or both true and false. So they won't fall under a predicate. So when people are looking for the common, looking for common ways of organizing, we could account for why everyone looks for mode A, because it has, let's say, the resources to have something impredicative. But we would be able to add that this is not a kind of freely associating communistic logic. It's just that it has that truth value. So it's not the same as exploring a new logical space or constructing positively a generic subset of people. It's just a defined set, which you can count everyone who is inside of it, but it's a world where it's okay to say that both proposition P and its negation will apply to that set. So it loses a bit of its kind of romantic appeal. We would be able to account for why everyone tries to harvest this power of contradictions from mode A, and why it's a limited power. It's not an infinite power that can take us any new place. And I think that current perspectivists, people who think anthropology is discovering the salvation of politics, they trust exactly this point. Lacanians who think that the extimate is like the kernel of the revolutionary subject, they trust the same point. Neo-rationalists who think that rules that revise themselves are gonna take us somewhere like uncharted territory, they also trust the normative power of community. So it's like it would be another polemical thing to say, as if they're not enough, So it would be interesting. It would be very nice if this is consistent, but there are these big formal challenges in the middle to make it cohere with the rest that I'm not sure how to deal with. I'm not sure, Dennis, if you ever looked into this.
Yeah, it's very ambitious. I don't know if I did find this one text while you were talking on trying to connect. There's this guy who's working on something called universal logic, which maybe
it's not Jean-Yves Bézieux, is it?
It is that guy, exactly.
He's a teacher in my university.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he's the head of my department.
Okay, so do you know about this then? Like, is it relevant to the paraconsistent?
Yeah, I think it is. But I never looked in detail into his work. I should email him about this. And
yeah, you should ask him maybe. But I had this. My only comment on this is this idea that that we kind of touched on the one of our last presentations, which is the idea that certain propositions are valid over a certain space is part of the I think part of the appeal of using Topos theory, right? Like Topos theory is all about generalizing set theory to the point where you can have locally true statements, whereas sets have universal extensional differences, right? So like this set is different from this set because one set contains an element not in the other. In a topos, you have these locales where some statements are true, but only in that locale, right? And so it's like it's very suited for contextual logic. So I wonder, in the move from classical to intuitionistic, you get this move towards contextual logic or like location specific knowledge. I wonder what is the analogous move when you go to this paraconsistent. I think that would be the theory of the topos for paraconsistent. Like what does space look like?
Exactly. For example, one of the contributions we will have is this text by Tiago, which he already wrote in Portuguese. I just recommended that he translated it. I'm not sure if he's going to add anything, but I was talking to him about the primer and this idea that we connected the power of money to see the value of other commodities to the internal structure of money. We show that, well, because money can be divided into kind of homomeric parts, right? The same quality, but just changing quantity. The relation between money and another commodity can be expressed in terms of the relation of money to itself, right? And then we were talking about this, and he said, well, I think that we can actually say something similar about what happens in kinship structures, not in the sense of homomeric relations of, qualitative fixation and quantity changes, but in the sense of something we could call heterometric relation. So for example, a mother and her baby, they don't form two. They form more than one, but less than two. Let's put it like this. So the relation of the baby is both outside of the mother and inside. Or in our case, we would write it as zero. Like at some point in these two sets, right, or two parts of the world, you can't disjoint them, right? Something about the two maps to the same point.
Yeah.
That makes the mother a special object in kinship relations, because you can express the alterity of people with regards to one another in terms of the internal alterity of a mother to herself. Right, so constructing this sort of universal inequivalence, right? Like universal self-difference, you can account for the differences between other things in terms of its own internal structure.
It's interesting, yeah.
See, like that would be the vulgar simplification of what this means. So there is something paraconsistent, like some paraconsistent flavor in the fact that there are propositions about, the sort of mother-baby unit, which you can't really place if you're talking about mother or baby, right? Mm-hmm. Because there's some sort of constitution of the mother to the baby and the baby to the mother and so on. And because this internal structure is, let's say, self-different, you can express in those terms relations between the mother and other kinship structures, kinship positions, right? That would be like a matrilineal structure.
It would also make a lot of sense of like the consistent attacks with the rise of states on matrilineal logics as an imposition of that new Boolean binarist logic on top.
Yeah, because you see, like that's where I would put A plus B, because
that's where like
patriarchy. Yeah,
really
but you see, like patriarchy, what does it do? It finds a different object to occupy that position and have that paraconsistent property. The father is inside and outside of the family. but it's no longer the consanguinity that is defining, like mother baby, for example, as the hereditary kind of lineament of reciprocity, but the fact that the family unit has an instance that is both inside and outside. So the guy is both father to the family, so he's inside, but he's also, let's say, the representative of the state, because he's, let's say, the worker, the citizen, and so on. So that would be, let's say, a mixed logic between A and its paraconsistent structure and state, which is classical structure. Like
We could
state,
also account for the role of homo soccer then in terms of this too. It's the father's power to put someone in that position of the kind of inside outside and to like regulate that logic.
yeah. So you see, like it does,
Yeah.
you can develop on top of it, you know.
Yeah.
And I mean,
There is.
yeah. Sorry.
Sorry. No, go on. Go on.
I was gonna say that, for example, this is for me what really convinced me that this is a good path. Like this is Lévi-Strauss's atom of kinship, right? It says that there is a man who has a sister, and there is another man who has his sister, and this sister marries. So she's the sister of this guy, she's the sister of this guy, and sister one marries man two, and sister two marries man one, and through this, these two guys here establish their own relation, right? So if we take that mother-baby thing we were talking about, where household relations get value 0, this here is value 0. There, something in them is mapped as if it's talking about both of them at the same time, even though they're separate, right? And here as well, the value would be 0. But when S1 marries man 2, this has value 1. They form like a couple, an interior. And the same on the other side. And in this way, they form here 2 things, an exterior. So you can actually use this tree-valued logic to define why this is the atom of kinship. So that's really cool.
It's fascinating. It's
Yeah,
really cool.
It's really
It's
cool. And you know, people
Because
use,
even
sorry, yeah?
like I was thinking, because I got to this in a seminar that I was taking a while ago, and it was an entirely different thing, but it got to we got to that same point of like we were actually reading Shakespeare and like Coriolanus, and it has like, it's crazy how most of the tragedies rely on that structure, in the sense of like with Coriolanus it's the same thing. So like you have you sort of have these women, both the mother and the wife, getting into the way of sovereignty in a lot of ways. So like you have this customary kinship connection getting in the way of sovereignty as like the fulfillment of the sovereign task and so on. And like you have this sort of like disturbancy, and this is it's a very recurring motive that a lot of people like express, and it's usually like not read like in tandem with like the actual social determinations of that. It's usually rather sort of like drama, like familial drama, but it has this very, like, I think it has this very social grounding in the clash between modes A and B in a lot of ways, and like how can they
that's really interesting.
be operationalized and count together. Like this is very cool.
And you know, like now that you said this is something I really wanted to do. But look, I'm just, you know, like this is something that we could imagine as, you know, this is a weird sort of space that has like some resolutions, things are being covered by the same blob. In a different resolution, they're covered by intersecting blobs. And then, you know, like you need to be able to compose in a way that sometimes 2 things that already intersected, they again don't have intersection, or, you know, like one thing takes the other. But just 2 things. Like the first is that, you know, like people said that Lévi-Strauss was crazy because why didn't he define the atom of kinship as a blood family, right? Like man, female, and baby, like this. And he said that the atom of kinship requires non-blood relations. like, so the minimal unit of a reciprocal space has both bloodlines and non-bloodline kinship, right? So it's not enough to have like the zero thing. You need to have like some other structure, and that forms the minimal unit.
Yeah.
So we kind of can account for this because this is the minimal unit for you to have all three values kind of stitching together the space, right? But on the topic of Coriolanus, what I wanted to say is that I've been obsessing this last couple of days with the idea that we can find good TV series that fit each of these things, you know, like, of course, The Wire is obviously the only one that deals with everything because you can actually, like, obviously.
I still have to watch it. I
I don't want to give spoilers, but like, you could write something like this. This is Barksdale. This is Stringer Bell for people in the know, and this is Marlowe. Like you can actually map this. Then I was thinking like this TV series that is making a lot of success now called Succession. Have you guys seen it?
Not yet. I'm also like,
because
I was looking into it.
I've seen some of it.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly about A plus C, right? What is family under capitalistic social forms?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say like The Sopranos, like how do you keep a community under, you know, the pressure of capitalist relations? And the Succession I would put here, you know. There's probably another one that could go here. I'm not sure which one. So I'm sure we could also like cover it with cultural products as well. Like,
yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
but
B
I think
plus C is trickier.
Yeah, B plus C. I was thinking like, I have one suggestion, which is a really weird movie. Have you guys seen the remake of Godzilla, the Japanese remake? Gojira.
No.
I really recommend it. It's a weird movie because it's about like Godzilla. He comes from through the water, like he's a catastrophe, like a natural thing that we produce through our like crazy Anthropocene forces. But you cannot deal with such a monstrous creature through individuals. So 80% of the movie is about meetings that this big bureaucratic organization in Japan has, trying to decide what to do about Godzilla. So they say, let's throw, like, you can't decide, let's nuke Godzilla. You need to go through an assembly with experts. They tell you what will happen. Then you take that report back to some leader, and then he talks to diplomats. So you can see the state structure trying to answer to this kind of capitalist monster, you know, and trying to be like at the level of it. But I swear to you, like I don't know who thought of this movie because it's so in your face that it's trying to tell that story, you know. Like the individual characters are not that important. You forget their names. The individual dramas are very kind of poorly narrated. Most of it is about this like big assemblies of a lot of people trying to follow like bureaucratic protocols to make collective decisions about how to answer to this huge creature, you know. It's very weird movie. I would put it in the B plus C column, but there probably are other good things.
But this is very tricky to visualize now that we are talking about it. Like, I think it's very tricky to like, because A plus C is very easy. Like you can be, because I think there is something about this genre of like family life being disrupted by capitalism, which is very frequent, even in like I don't know, more like even sitcoms and stuff.
Yeah,
always
true.
talk about that. Like, I don't know, A plus B, I don't know, Parks and Recreation is something like, it's a very particular way of like
That's a really good one. Yeah, I like that.
Yeah, in a sitcom form, like the A plus B side, in which like you build this sort of like different community because you work in this sort of different place, which is not a like a commodity job in a way. and but also you're treated as someone that should work in a commodity job.
Yeah,
But B plus
exactly.
C is very weird because I think it's sort of like
Have you seen that series Veep?
V.
Veep. It's about the vice president. It's with that woman who used
Oh
to
yeah,
do
yeah, yeah.
Seinfeld.
Very good.
Yeah, I'd probably
Oh.
put it here. I don't know.
Yeah, it could be something like, I don't know, those dramas like House of Cards could be something of like B plus C in a way.
Yeah, it's not about the
Most
family
fiction-
stuff. Right? It's like,
Most fiction has like communities at its center at some
Yeah.
form. I think Veep includes that.
yeah, I mean, but it, yeah, I agree. But like the individual dramas, like the family. I mean, I totally agree that everything that has to do with A is easier to find because Hollywood is like, they know that there's something about the sort of broken existence of reciprocity in our society that makes it the most romantic of modes for all the reasons we were
Yeah.
talking about before, right? So
Yeah.
I
the
wonder
te-
if some of those reality TV shows like Dirty Jobs that have people doing like they're at work and they're showing different kind of like moments of capitalist life, but they're spectacularized as reality TV. That could be kind of like a B and C. Like they're made into entertainment.
yeah, but yeah, I
I
agree
also
with
think
you.
about sci-fi. Like sci-fi is sort of this genre in which I think that you can find a lot of like B plus C. Like
Dune is kind of like B plus C.
Yeah.
But it's also has A though with
Yeah, Dune is
Yeah.
probably in the center here,
it's
perhaps.
in the center.
Yeah,
Dune is with The Wire
Yeah.
for sure.
Yeah,
yeah.
But I think a lot of
it could be
dystopias
found.
like Brave New World would be B plus C, where there is no real like community connection and like the character interactions are pretty superficial, but you have this massive machine and everyone's playing a lot of dystopians, I would agree, or dystopia stories are B plus C.
yeah, I agree.
Black Swan
mean-
has a lot, or Black Mirror, sorry, has a lot of
Yeah, Black
Yeah.
Mirror is all about B plus C, I'd say.
Yeah. And it performs B plus C in this very particular way, right? In which like you can get a sort of like, because I think this is the relief of when you watch something like B plus C, because it's usually first it comes with that like newer aesthetic of like, oh yeah, I'm making a unsaturated movie to make you think, but also like it has this it has this quality of like sort of detaching you from like being involved in it in a way, because it shows like such an overstretched version of what you already live that like you can actually rest a little bit
Yeah.
like
What if I
while
would-
you're at it.
Talking about sci-fi, where would you put the Matrix? Like, I think the Matrix might be like the Wire, like. But it's yeah,
I
it's
think so.
yeah. I mean, it's not really like it. Perhaps it's more like A plus B even because, like, what is it kind of empties out the discussion of. I mean, it's not true. Like, it gives you a image for exploitation in terms of people are batteries. Like, that's not really B, right? That's more
Yeah.
C. So I don't know. I would put it as a candidate here as well, perhaps.
Brazil is a good.
Yeah. Would you put
Terry
Brazil?
Gill.
Yeah, I like that. Would you put it in the center or would you put it like in
I think it's
B?
B plus C, right?
Yeah, probably here, right? Like movies
It's
about.
like everyone's atomized already, and
Yeah,
there's
exactly.
really no community. It's just like you and the bureaucracy, and then yeah, like every day is Christmas. Like,
Yeah, I tend to think that like movies that romanticize a mode rather than deal with its questions are not really about that mode, right? So Brazil has this sort of romantic idea of connection, romantic love, but it's so far-fetched and even gets kind of destroyed at the end that it doesn't really deal with
Yeah.
that part. Like, whereas in the Matrix, they do manage to have like, the internet is the like metaphor for protocols. People are batteries and machines rule the world as kind of automation and labor. And then you also have like resentment, envy, all those problems of mode A, political communities having troubles as well, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is also why it's such a kind of classic cultural thing. Like it's hard to pack all of that into a kind of sort of world, right?
Yeah, it's hard to do it and not escape into some really crazy metaphor, right?
Yeah.
The Wire somehow does it without like a metaphor.
Yeah, The Wire is really crazy. The only thing missing from The Wire is politics. Like there's no politics in the world of The Wire. That's really crazy. Like they don't show they don't show any social movements or they don't take seriously that there is anything politically happening. I mean, politics really is a kind of almost miraculous kind of little moment, right?
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. The closest you get is the politics within the police department, something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I think that like it has a very Frederick Jameson touch, which is the desire to investigate, the desire to kind of learn about and pull threads. That's kind of mode D. It's like an ethical imperative that will make you asocial, will take you out of your community, will destroy your life, but you can't kind of let it go. So you have like the core policeman having that sort of thing, right? And also like the core guys from the projects, they also like the ones that we like Omar, who's like a nomadic guy. You have like people with a sort of ethical imperative being the only things outside of it, right?
Well, to go back to what you brought up earlier about TB, Gabriel, about like building a place for the perspective of the state, for looking like a state. That's something that's interesting about shows like The Wire, and also like the first season of True Detective, which I think is really interesting, is that it is like, these are stories that reveal a lot of the world from the perspective of like one of the quintessential agents of the state, police, right? And particularly investigating police, detectives. And the privileged space of things like, I mean, I think True Detective is brilliant in looking at the weird social role that interrogation plays in today's society. It's kind of weird confessional role and the weird kind of way you build a relationship within that. But it's always, again, under the perspective of TB. And there's something about like the way The Wire, it can simultaneously kind of see the whole of K superscript C, but because it's from that perspective, that seems also why it can't see any real politics, because it is the perspective of the state. It literally,
it's true,
cannot see the political. Whereas like TC, like capitalism has always been able to see politics. It just can only see them as something to kind of exploit and like take advantage of. TB is just literally like nothing to see there.
I think Sopranos has this quality of like how it sees politics, because it sees politics like politics is the background of familial life. So like it's sort of something that like differs the tensions within the familial nucleus. So like you have, for example, like when Meadow goes to the university and she becomes this sort of like liberal rich girl, and then she has to face like her own family back, and like you have this like, so you sort of displace the same familial conflict like through a political divergence between both of them. And like I think that this is like, but also this perspective of the state, like in shows that are, I think, sort of like protagonized by cops or by any kind of agent of the law. I think this is really interesting. Like even you mentioned True Detective, but also even like stuff like the X-Files, for example, which has a huge, I think, it has a huge thing on how we think. I have a friend of mine that she's from like this very specific fan studies area, and like they are obsessed with X-Files, because X-Files is the first fandom which and that became like this very organized and monetized modern fandom. Like it's sort of the blueprint of like modern fandoms, because it became like both a community for like crazy people that were into conspiracy theories, and like also like normal people that just wanted to see like Mulder and Scully finally kiss or something, or like buy some merch.
That was me. I watched the whole of X-Files expecting the moment.
Yeah, in which they would be happy, right?
Yeah, exactly. But now that you say this, like this really goes to what you were saying before, John, about conspiracy, because I would put X-Files here, because I think, I mean, they substitute capital for an alien invasion, right? Every time you need to account for like, why are people being exploited, experimented at a bodily level and so on, it's always aliens. So it's a form of domination. So it's kind of a weird mix of, like, they think the parasitic relation of capital to the world in terms of a parasitic form of life dominating the world. So it's mode B, and it has the fetishism of every weird effect can be explained by the right network of personal connections, right? Like, so it's the prototype of this sort of conspiracy. And it's really amazing I watched it again like last year, the whole thing, and it's amazing how ambivalent it is. Like, it has this anti-state critique of the military complex in the States, but it already prepares this kind of alt-right, dark, deep state kind of conspiracy, kind of grammar. It's already there, you know, but it has a bit more of a, it's really weird because in the first seasons, Mulder it's like an anthropologist, like he's like Eduardo Viveiros de Castro, like everyone he takes seriously. The person says, I saw the werewolf. He says, this is true, you know, every cosmology is valid, and it's just a different perspective, and he tries all the time to kind of compatibilize it with science, right, and with study. And slowly it becomes more conservative as a TV show. It's really weird.
I think I really like. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh no, I was just saying I really like how, like, in X-Files, every episode Scully is skeptical. Every episode she's proven wrong, and then the next episode she's still skeptical. Like, you just saw werewolves in the previous episode, but now you're gonna say, no, this is
where I draw the line.
Yeah, and like, it's funny because it's always like, I don't know, her flashlight fails, and then Mulder gets, I don't know, attacked by some sort of like crazy stuff that lurks into pipes, and then she only gets there and she's like, I didn't see it.
Exactly.
Let's wait until the next one, you know. It's, I cannot explain this, but also like, hold on.
But that's a really good point though, because that also kind of like plays into the caricature of science by conspiracy theorists right now, that you have this like, because right, she's not actually being scientific, she's continually presented with evidence and she won't change her position.
She's the greatest believer of all.
Right, and she's depicted as just like an institutional adherent to science, which is exactly how conspiracy theorists see like the, you know, epidemiologists and vaccine and everything right now is like, oh, this isn't really science, you're just saying it for institutional reasons.
It's true. It's
true. You know, the really brave thing to do is to just disregard all protocol like Mulder does and just charge in single-handedly to a government facility, and you'll be fine. The good guys will protect you.
Because somehow there is someone there that like will watch you, and like they will die, but you will never die. Don't worry.
It's true, man. I mean,
it's untrue, right? Because you do see, like right now with the investigations of Jan 6 in the United States, there are people in the government that covered for the insurrectionists. So they can say like, oh yeah, no, totally. Like there's like even a trace of reality in there.
And you know, like it's deeply disturbing how Scully then, like from what you guys are saying, she's the perfect kind of partner to the alt-right. Like it mixes misogyny, because there is a bit of misogyny in X-Files. Like they play on her feminine stubbornness, you know, like they turn this sort of coldness of a sort of, you know, the FBI bitch kind of thing. It feeds the skepticism, you know. It goes really to the point. Somebody should write about Scully and the alt-right.
I think I was thinking about this because like I watched the whole thing like sort of recently, like this year, I think, and like even particularly towards the end, I think there are two things that sort of like put this like the course of those things to happen. Like, and there first it's Doggett when he comes, which is sort of like the traditional
exterminator.
This sort of like traditional cop that it looks like a straight from out of an action movie, and like he cannot fathom what's happening there, and like he looks at things and he's like, what is this, what you guys are doing? And like he has this sort of like it's an skepticism that is very different from like Scully and Mulder, because he's portrayed as this sort of a simpleton, and like a lot of times it's like people mention that, oh yeah, you're not Oxford educated, you know, like you're not as smart as Mulder would be, you're not the scientist that Scully is, so like this is why you cannot like believe stuff, and like you're just stuck into your own like drama and Dead Son and this type of stuff. And then it's like, because when like when Mulder returns, it's impossible, like it's the most I don't know, plot gymnastics ever made, the fact that Mulder is not fully outright like by the time that like the return happens, because he's sort of like he involves himself with like the alt-right, and he sort of talks with that guy, which is like this famous journalist, and this type of stuff, which is very well played, by the way. It's a completely disgusting guy. And at the same time, like there is a sort of complicity of him with that guy, that like a sort of like thing that you see that there is a common grammar, but it's somehow Scully never lets him be too crazy. So she both like save him from like himself, and she also like becomes the main enabler of the stuff, because she's always testing.
We
Well,
should
also,
definitely
like,
write a section
I've only
on.
seen the early seasons, but he has to save her almost every episode. Like there's so many like traditional kind of dynamics like that.
Man, like in the first two seasons, she never says her own name by herself. Like she never introduces herself. He introduces her every episode. Like she doesn't even get to say her name by herself. Like it's really. I was watching it with Louise, and she was like, "Do you realize that this woman, like, two things happen every episode for like 3 seasons? He says, 'I'm Mulder, this is Scully,' and second, he tells her to split. You go this way, I go this way. Every fucking episode for like 3 seasons.
Yeah.
Then
That's
she gets
true,
a bit
actually.
more like complicated as a character, like her family life comes into it. But in the beginning, it's like really, really absurd. I mean, we
But
should
he
definitely
still
have like
seems
a
considered like a positive shift from like the 80s cop characters who had just been so overtly misogynist that someone that was like politely misogynist was like,
yeah. I mean, I think it's a really weird series if you think about it. Like you can see it was influenced. By the way, where would we put Twin Peaks into this?
Oh
Because-
yeah, it's another Borromean knot.
All together.
Yeah, no, but I think it's a sort of because I think what makes Twin Peaks alluring is the fact that like you begin from the A plus B problematic, but you stick to the A. Like
Yeah, I would say
finally,
Twin Peaks is just here.
yeah, because it's about community life, and like everything that gets abstracted from like those eerie towns in which there is no outside structure. Like
Yeah,
the only and everything can happen.
Yeah, I would say that
police are a personal institution. The capitalists are personally connected to everyone. Like everyone is personally connected.
yeah, and everything that is too much structure becomes metaphysical, right? If there is no abstraction, there is metaphysics, like metaphysical experience. So if you like policemen who don't only represent communities, they don't represent the state. They represent like a weird existential experience and things like that. And I also wonder, I mean, this is something I've been really interested in, because I think that there is a weird connection between Twin Peaks and this sort of use of existential dread to signify abstract structure that a lot of the Black cultural movement in the States today is using, like Jordan Peele's movies, which use the sort of
Jordan Peele
unease, in the background. It's not about social realism of structural racism. It's about, like, Atlanta has the same feeling. Like, it's not about the fact that there is a cop who represents power and you then see the cop doing something bad to you, like realistic depiction of violence. It's about this weird kind of atmosphere that things can go wrong at any moment. So they politicized Lynch's strategy, And like it's a big movement. Like you get like Jordan Peele's movies, I think Donald Glover's Atlanta, but in music as well, Kendrick Lamar has a bit of this. Like there's a kind of weird anti-realist kind of trend where there's a lot of atmosphere and a sort of use of the feeling of unease or feeling that there's something abstract, like a vibe, you know, that can be
Yeah.
the stand-in for abstract structure, you know?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I think this is very. I think this is very interesting. Like I was there was a thing at the news center at some point with Esther Leslie. Like
Yeah, I would put a
she's this sort of like Benjaminian scholar. Like and she works with like the concept of atmosphere, and so but she has this very like concrete takes in which like you know those she's sort of like Mackenzie Ward in that, you know, like when matter becomes metaphor and when metaphor becomes matter, so like the whole kind of vibe of like and she works with that, with the concept of like an atmosphere, and she has this very like trying to see like media structures through these metaphors and like bubbles and foam and like how those things get like get intertwined, and I think that she gets to something around those lines of like what kind of like turbid medias that like cannot be represented through like that cannot be like they cannot solve the puzzle of communication, so what kind of atmosphere do they create in order to like actually cover up for that like lack in communication in a way. And I think this is a really cool thing. I think that there is Pellegritzer's like formal theory of like mathematical theory of vibe also, which is like,
it's really interesting stuff.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing. I never could get it, but like I really like to hear him talk, but it's not something that I know how to manage. And I think there's a lot of meat in that. But what I was going to say about Twin Peaks is that I think that it has this quality of like because even the movements like the moments like in which the FBI is portrayed from the perspective of like the protagonist, it's always like the FBI is this intimate thing which you encounter. So like it's not the agent, it's your friend Albert, which comes and he's the very strict guy, and like it's your other friend which becomes Denise, which is actually Dave Duchovny actually.
You know, I would actually define, I think that we could define Twin Peaks as like, say, what happens when you take the contrarian movement here, like what of A exists under KC, like because it's not A in pure form, right? It's like is if you abstract from everything else and look at community, but it's not like fully fledged community. It's like just this sort of incomplete state of reciprocity under capitalism. So it's still, let's say, FBI and, you know, people who deal with factories and things like this, but you remove all the abstract stuff, and then you get this weird, so it's almost like you project back onto A, right? Not from A to KC, but from KC back to A. Like, what could you see only in that point of view, right? I think
Lynch is all about that. Like,
I totally agree.
Because like with Blue Velvet, if you think about it, it's sort of like this. There is this. It's this dimension of something like this eroded family, like from the like Isabella Rossellini's character, that gets eroded by those outside ambitions. But then what do you get? But I think that the good move that he gets there is that those things never succeed. They always fail terribly. Like even like when in the end of like Blue Velvet, like you have the main guy staying with like the main blonde girl, but you have that ravaged, crazy family that stays there and like sort of weaves that very Americana choreographed style, but like it never mends. It becomes this sort of like.
But I think the other side of that is that it's also a wrong reading to think that he's like criticizing the American family. Like he really loves it.
Yeah,
like, I don't think it's ironic at all, right? I mean. He just loves it so much that he includes into his depiction the fact that it's broken, right?
It's the full package. It's the full package in a way.
I mean, and this also explains why, you know, Lacanians are obsessed with Lynch, because I mean it's kind of the same turf in a way. We definitely should add a section called film tips, like movies, TV, like serious suggestions for our readers.
Yeah, I think it gets really like it could be something like actually very simple, like from the perspective of I don't know, like Jameson's how does it call it? It's not cognitive mapping. It's like the other thing that Lauren Berlin has a whole chapter about it, like sort of structure of feeling in a way.
Yeah,
like Raymond
exactly.
Williams, actually. Like
Yeah.
because I think they sort of like if we look at movies as like sort of setting structures of feelings for like those modes and like sort of slicing feelings like as such. I think it's a very slicing how one feels those structures. I think it's the
man, that could really work. I mean, I'm actually tempted to. I mean, we could just add like with not saying much, like no TV guides, and then just have the diagram with a bunch of suggestions, perhaps one line per like like when you have like short synopses, Karatani synopses of each thing, and just have it there.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be fun actually. It could be like something.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I'm crazy enough to like that. I'm not sure what everyone would. I mean, it's theory fiction after all. It would be the fictional part. Like,
yeah, we're sort of outsourcing the fictional part.
Yeah, exactly.
Like people are already working within the model. Don't worry. You know?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it would be also a nice hint to Pellegrini, because I think that his work, like what he thinks vibes are to aesthetic objects, it's very similar to what we're doing with political objects. Like he takes the idea that, there is an objective structure that kind of is able to is structured in such a way that it's able to kind of see a certain collection of cultural things, and that relation he calls a vibe, right? And he uses machine learning, so pretty much like categorical cybernetics is just around the corner, but pretty much reparameter, I don't know how to say that word, but optics pretty much, to talk about how you could actually kind of learn and create that model, right? So it's very close, but for a different area. So perhaps we could even lure him in with something like that.
Yeah, I'm like, I think 2 people away from him, because like there is Homolo and there's him. So, but I can definitely like try to get some hints and try to see what he thinks about it. I think it would be a good idea, actually.
Yeah, it would really be cool.
Yeah.
Anyway, guys, I love that we managed to turn the last hour into a TV guide, but I'll have to go now.
Yeah, same.
Hey, real quick, I was wondering, I'm going to be gone at an appointment on the 15th. So I was wondering if I could submit a draft before this weekend and go over it next.
Yeah, it would be great. I mean, I think
along with other things, but just like if we could check that off the list beforehand.
Yeah, but what I was gonna suggest is that we try to have, let's say, drafts of at least some of the sections, like so that we can read beforehand all of it, and then like go one by one in the meeting, like discuss each of them. So if you have like 4 or 5 of those, is already enough for a meeting. So
that'd be good.
Great.
It'd also be nice, like, to do that thing where if you bring something up that someone else is diving into, to be able to cross-reference internally.
Yeah, I think that exactly, like if we have some drafts in that folder, it's easier. For example, I'm doing this with Rafael now. I'm reading his draft and just suggesting like, perhaps we can be consistent with the terms here, and things like this. So
cool.
Great, guys.
Yeah, great.
All right, take care, guys.
Take care,
everyone. Bye.
See ya.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.